With temperatures increasing by the day, it's time to talk about sodium supplementation, sodium sweat testing, and whether or not those are strategies and approaches that are worth your time, energy, and money. There are a lot of sports supplement companies that market sodium as a key ingredient in beverages and supplements as a way to enhance performance, prevent cramping, among other supposed benefits. There's also a range of companies that promote sensors and testing for sodium in the sweat and concentrations, and that being an integral, important part of an athlete's sort of toolkit. So, kind of the goal here is to talk a little bit about sodium as an ingredient in sports supplements, how important it might be or might not be, whether the athletes really need to think about individualized testing, and whether or not supplementation during exercise is really, an imperative part of an athlete's performance and health. So the first part of this is to think about sodium in particular as the major electrolyte that you're going to lose through sweating. Of course, there are other electrolytes that you're going to lose in sweat, including potassium, magnesium, calcium. But sodium and chloride are really the two that you find in the largest concentrations. And sodium is going to be the one that we really focus most of the attention on here. So, how much sodium does an athlete typically lose in their sweat? Well, it depends on whether you're talking about total sodium losses and just total grams per day or milligrams per day, or if you're kind of standardizing it as a concentration, which is probably the more typical approach, is to think about what is the concentration of sodium in an athlete's sweat. That typically ranges from maybe a couple hundred milligrams per liter of sweat on the low end to a couple thousand milligrams of sodium on the higher end. So you might have upwards of a tenfold variation between athletes in terms of the concentration of sodium that is found in their sweat on a per liter basis. So a lot of between athlete variability. And from that perspective, it does make sense, or it seems to make sense, that knowing an athlete's sweat sodium concentration could be a valuable piece of information, given that there can be so much difference between one athlete and the next. Now, what are the things that really dictate that variability? Why do we see some athletes being low sodium sweaters versus others really having highly concentrated sort of sodium levels in their sweat? Like anything else, genetics is probably the primary determinant. There are certainly some studies that suggest there are genes that predispose athletes to losing more sodium in their sweat. That's still an area that's underexplored, particularly in exercise science. But given what we know so far from available evidence, just the fact that every human physiological response is determined by genetics, we know that that's going to be an important player in determining athletes' sweat sodium losses. Obviously, that's not really controllable. You don't get to pick what your genetics are. So that's just something you're kind of dealt with, that you're dealt in terms of your sweat sodium concentrations. So what outside of genetics might also be explaining why there's differences between athletes with respect to how much sodium they're losing? What several studies have shown at this point is that the more sodium you eat, the more you lose in your sweat as a concentration. So these are based on highly controlled feeding studies where athletes are given set amounts of sodium from maybe low to medium to high or just low to high. And you look at over the course of a couple of days or a week, what happens to sodium losses in different fluids in the body, including sweat. What you typically see is the biggest change in sodium losses is in urine. So if you start eating a lot of sodium in your diet, your body is going to adjust by excreting a lot of that sodium in the urine. And that generally is the largest sort of change that you see from going from a low sodium diet to a high sodium diet. But what you also see is there is an increase, not the same extent as what you see in urine, but there is an increase in the concentration of sodium in sweat when you take somebody, put them on a higher sodium diet relative to a moderate or low sodium diet. So, kind of ironically, right, when we think about people who are salty sweaters, sometimes we think, well, they need to eat more sodium. And in some of those cases, it could be part of the explanation for why they're such a salty sweater is because they are already eating so much sodium. Now, that seems to be less of an important player than probably somebody's genetics. So I would say it's a possible explanation or part of the explanation for why somebody might be losing a lot of sodium in their sweat, but it certainly is not going to be the only one. So what you need to think about is, particularly if you're going to test somebody's sodium levels in their sweat over time and try and get a reasonable sort of assessment that's accurate, you need to consider that dietary intake is going to impact what you see in terms of their sweat sodium losses. Now, a third factor here that may explain differences between people is how fit they are or how acclimatized they are to especially a hot environment. We know from a variety of research that when you take people, put them through several days of heat acclimation training, or maybe they're exercising for an hour or two in a hot, humid environment, sweat rates obviously go up, and there's a host of physiological changes that cause the body to be better at reabsorbing sodium ions in sweat. So you're holding on to more of that sodium, at least when it comes to sweat losses, and the body over the course of several days is going to get better, and your sweat is going to become more dilute than what it was prior to the heat acclimation. So athletes who are doing some heat training or are accustomed to the heat and who are more fit may have lower levels of sweat sodium concentrations than athletes who are not acclimatized to a hot environment or who have a lower fitness level. So there's at least a few factors here to consider why there's such variability between athletes with respect to their sweat sodium concentrations. Genetics, dietary intake, and then how acclimatized they are to a hot, sort of stressful environment where we expect sweating rates to be quite high. So, with that in mind, the question arises, is it worthwhile to test objectively what an athlete's sweat sodium concentration might be? There's a variety of companies out there that advertise this sort of testing as being really, really critical for an athlete to understand and be able to develop an individualized hydration and sodium supplementation protocol. I think there is some potential value to doing these objective tests, particularly for athletes who are ultra athletes who are doing multiple hours of exercise in a row and whose performances in the events that they partake in last multiple hours or longer. For other athletes who are not doing as much volume and whose performances are less than a couple of hours or a few hours, I honestly don't think it's particularly helpful to know what your sweat sodium concentrations are through objective testing. I think it's probably overkill in most cases. Now, why do I think that? Part of the impetus for these tests is to develop an individualized sodium replacement plan during exercise. That's what a lot of these companies will market. What the goal or one of the goals of the testing is to come up with an individualized plan. There's plenty of research. Probably, I think the best sort of scientific review on this was written by Alan McCubbin out of Australia, talking about sodium supplementation and blood sodium levels. And it's not really until you get several hours into exercise with someone drinking a relatively high amount of fluid would you start to have to worry about plasma or serum sodium levels declining in a way that may be concerning or have negative effects. Generally speaking, with a couple hours of exercise or a few hours of exercise, serum sodium or plasma sodium levels are relatively stable in most individuals, with a few exceptions Meaning you probably don't have to get overly concerned about trying to come up with a highly, highly precise sodium supplementation protocol with the goal of trying to stabilize plasma sodium levels or serum sodium levels. Now, there may be other arguments why someone may recommend that you supplement with sodium during exercise and why objective testing may be valuable for some of those individuals. But I think another piece of the puzzle here is that you can get a reasonably good estimation of sodium sweat losses from just self-reported or perceived sweat saltiness. There's a really interesting study that I can link to in the comments that was published, almost 10 years ago now, where they took objective sweat measurements, sweat sodium measurements, and then also asked athletes to sort of report whether or not they thought they were salty sweaters or not. And they just kind of rated on a question, how much sodium do you think you lose in your sweat? Low, moderate, high, or very high. So they prompted these people by telling them that observing white marks on your clothing or your apparel after training is an indicator of high sodium losses, or your eyes stinging from your sweat, or tasting sort of your sweat that has a salty taste to it. So they gave a little bit of context to these individuals before they asked them, how much sodium do you think you lose in your sweat? And asked them to rate again, either low, moderate, high, or very high. And when they compared those ratings, it was just very basic self-reported ratings of sweat sodium losses to the objective markers, they found quite high correlations between what was self-reported and what was actually measured objectively in the sweat. So in American football players, the correlation was 0.96. In basketball players, it was 0.95. Rugby athletes, 0.81. And soccer athletes, 0.75. Meaning across all these different sports, it was a sort of fairly strong to very strong agreement between perceived saltiness of sweat and the actual objective measurement. So, I think what this tells you is you can get probably a reasonable approximation or reasonable idea about sort of sweat sodium losses or concentration just based on these more simple observations you can make around training, afterwards, in terms of if you're seeing your clothing or your apparel having those white marks on them, or if your eyes are stinging from sweat. Obviously not perfect, but it's probably more realistic for many athletes to at least track that regularly or have an idea about what that might look like as opposed to doing objective testing. So an important question, I think, is whether or not objective sweat sodium testing is something worth investing in. And what you hear from a lot of the companies that promote this or individuals who promote this is that you would take that information, you have a kind of a precise measurement or what you think is a precise measurement in terms of sweat sodium losses on, let's say, a concentration basis. And then you could use that information to develop a hydration plan that targets a specific amount of sodium, per hour that you're trying to ingest to kind of match the outs and the ins when it comes to sodium. That sounds logical. That sounds intuitively correct. But the question is, does precisely matching the intake to the output during exercise specifically lead to better outcomes, whether that's performance or less muscle cramping or whatever it may be? And there really is not research to support the idea that if you precisely match the intake to the output, that it's going to lead to better outcomes. Studies that have given sodium in isolation or isolated sodium as a supplement and looked at performance have not found really, in most cases, any difference. So performance-wise, at least in the context of the studies that have been done, which for the most part last, a couple hours to a few hours, there doesn't appear to be a clear scientific signal that sodium is a performance enhancer on its own. As a component of an electrolyte beverage with carbohydrate and fluid, Sure, there's going to be some performance advantages to ingesting that combination of ingredients, but it is probably more the carbohydrate in the fluid that really is leading to better maintenance of performance. Now, particularly if an athlete is exercising or performing for less than a few hours, that's really not enough time to accumulate enough sodium losses to see substantial declines in, let's say, serum sodium levels, unless the athlete is drinking way too much fluid. But if the athlete is drinking a reasonable amount of fluid, let's say 50% of their sweat losses or 50 to 75% of their sweat losses, there just isn't enough time in the course of a few hours for serum sodium levels to change in a way that is likely to negatively impact performance or the risk of muscular cramping. Now, if you get beyond a few hours, that becomes a different story. If we're talking about an ultra endurance race like the Western States Endurance Run, where the winners are around, 14 hours to 15 hours for the men and women, then yeah, in theory, there is some plausible benefits to maybe more closely matching your sodium intake to your output. And that may be a scenario where I don't think it's necessary to do sweat sodium testing for most athletes, but if they want to do that and they want to have a better idea about exactly what they're losing, there are some theoretical benefits to that if they want to come up with a strategy that better matches the ins and the outs during the course of exercise. Ultimately, for most athletes who are training, maybe 1 to 2 hours per day, you can replace those sodium losses after exercise, after training, and there really isn't a strong rationale to have to target sodium supplementation during the exercise itself. Now, another topic that often comes up is whether or not sodium is something that prevents muscle cramping. It's a widespread belief among athletes that it is a key ingredient in supplements and beverages that helps to prevent or treat muscle cramps during the course of a variety of different types of sporting events, whether it's endurance, American football, basketball. And there is some basis to think that electrolyte levels, particularly, in the muscle, more locally, can play a role in muscle cramping. Ron Mon, who's a well-known sports physiologist from the United Kingdom, wrote a really good review about sort of muscle cramping and the role of hydration and electrolytes several years ago, and pointed to some historical studies in industrial workers, so steel mill workers, construction workers, miners, back in the 1920s and 30s, where muscle cramping would be a relatively common thing that would affect these workers. And in part, what they tended to observe was that oftentimes there was heavy sweat losses among these workers because they're obviously doing a very physical job. And they were drinking a lot of low sodium fluid, and treating these industrial workers with saline or with electrolyte tablets seemed to help resolve some of their muscle cramping. There's other evidence from other clinical populations that disturbances in electrolyte balance can also impact the risk of muscle cramping. Now, does that translate to exercise and prolonged endurance events, for example? Probably yes and no. I think the consensus nowadays that I would kind of agree with is that muscle cramping has multiple contributors to it. The types of risk factors are going to vary depending on the situation. Probably different for a marathoner or an ultra runner versus an American football player in terms of what might be going on there. The American football player might be more neuromuscular fatigue from high level sprinting activity. In an ultra runner, maybe other contributors like heavy losses of sweating and electrolytes combined with neuromuscular fatigue and muscular damage from multiple hours of exercise. I think there's again multiple contributions that vary somewhat from case to case and situation to situation. But we know it's a neuromuscular problem that in some instances may be impacted by certain nutritional factors. some of which could include hydration status and electrolyte balance. Now, I think what we also can kind of agree is it's not just dehydration. It is not just a lack of electrolyte intake or sodium intake. There really isn't much direct evidence in athletes that supplementing with sodium at high rates is going to be a really effective strategy at preventing muscle cramps. There just isn't evidence to support that. It doesn't mean that electrolyte intake isn't potentially important. It's just we don't have the evidence that I think most athletes assume that we do to really support the idea that there's a really precise recommendation we can give around electrolyte intake. So, for example, if you have a ultra athlete, marathoner, or a triathlete who has regular problems with muscle cramping, when you think about the relative risk and benefits of testing for sweat sodium concentrations, I think in that case it is worthwhile to explore that as an option. You could test what their sweat sodium concentrations are, and then you could try and develop a plan that replaces sodium at a rate that is relatively close to what their losses are. Now, obviously, to do this, you'd have to also have an idea about what their sweating rate is under a variety of different conditions, which is a relatively easy sort of number to figure out based on changes in body mass and fluid intake during training. You can kind of get a sense of what somebody is sweating on a per hourly basis if you are keeping track of weight loss and fluid intake during training sessions in different environments. You can use that in combination with their sweat sodium concentration information to develop a tailored plan. So for athletes who are dealing with regular muscle cramping, I'm somewhat skeptical that it's going to be the thing that fixes their muscle cramping, but there's not a lot of risk to doing this. Other than just wasting money and time on it. But I don't think there's a whole lot of downside or risks that come along with including sodium in your beverage or in your supplements at a rate that falls within typical sweat sodium concentrations. Now, if you've got an athlete who's losing, 2,000 milligrams of sodium per liter, you do want to be maybe a little bit careful about fully replacing that. You want to test that out to make sure that their stomach can handle that level of sodium and maybe even realize that you don't need to fully replace their sweat sodium losses, but you maybe want to have a higher amount than the typical athlete. So maybe for that athlete, they're going at around 1,000 milligrams on the high end per hour in terms of a sodium replacement rate. Still not fully replacing what they're losing, but might be an amount that is more appropriate for them versus an athlete who's only losing 400 or 500 milligrams of sodium per liter of sweat. So let's quickly sum things up. First off, there's a lot of variability between athletes in terms of how much sodium they're losing in their sweat as a concentration. You have some athletes, a couple hundred milligrams per liter, other athletes, 2,000 milligrams per liter. Most fall in between that somewhere, maybe 500 to 1,000 milligrams per liter. But there is a pretty good spread in terms of what athletes are losing on a concentration basis. Now, the determinants of that include genetics, which is probably the most important. Some people are just naturally salty sweaters, others not so much. Diet is going to make a difference. So the more sodium you consume, the more you're going to lose in your sweat. Now, the body adjusts for dietary sodium intake more so through what it's excreting in the urine, but there is still some impact on what you see in terms of sweat sodium concentration. Another factor here is going to be how trained and fit the athlete is, particularly also how acclimatized they are to hot and humid environments. The more experience an athlete has, or the more acclimated they are to a hot environment, the body's going to adjust to that by being a bit better at conserving sodium in sweat. So also the consideration is, do we need to actually objectively test to see what an athlete's sweat sodium concentration is? Personally, I think the vast majority of athletes do not need to do this. Most of the time, if you're training for less than a couple hours per day, and especially if your competitions are less than a few hours, it just isn't enough time for choices during exercise around sodium intake to meaningfully impact what happens during exercise. If you're going beyond a few hours, especially for ultra athletes, where competitions, the imbalances in ins and outs of fluid and sodium do have potentially more of an impact on performance in athlete health. I think there is a stronger argument to be made for perhaps seeking out some of that testing. Alternatively, you could just use self-reported or self-perceived sweat sodium losses to have an idea about, where you fall on that maybe 200 milligram to 2000 milligram per liter scale. The study I mentioned that asked people whether they're low, moderate, high, or very high sodium losers or salty sweaters, very high agreement between self-rated sweat sodium and what was objectively tested. So that's certainly an alternative option, I think, is a reasonable approach, even for ultra endurance athletes who might be the type of population where a knowledge of kind of your sweat sodium losses may be more important. Does sodium consumption during exercise enhance performance, prevent cramping? The evidence on that is a lot weaker than what most people actually think. There really is minimal direct evidence that including sodium in a beverage reduces the risk of muscle cramping or improves performance. However, the studies on that are a bit limited in terms of their duration, intensity, and sort of generalizability to real competitive environments. So I think it's still possible in some contexts that sodium, independently of fluid and carbohydrates, could have some performance effects, could contribute to low risk of muscle cramping. But the data does not support that. The caveat, again, being the science is a bit limited in terms of what it can tell us for extreme competitive environments. So I think when you look at the relative sort of risks and benefits, particularly for salty sweaters who are doing longer competitions, I think it is certainly reasonable to try and come up with a structured plan to replace sodium losses, with the hope that it does translate to some better performance, maybe reducing the risk of muscle cramping in some situations, but that is no guarantee. So contrary to what a lot of sports supplement companies will want you to believe, particularly those that are marketing electrolytes, I think it's on the sort of list of things to prioritize. It's relatively low compared to carbohydrate intake, fluid intake, and other things that have more direct evidence for being impactful for performance. So for any sports nutrition strategy, at the end of the day, what I like to think about is what is the evidence? In this case, it's not particularly strong that sodium is a performance enhancer or in isolation has a profound impact on muscle cramping in most athletic competitions. But at the same time, also think what are the potential benefits and risks, ignoring even what the scientific evidence says. There are theoretical benefits here to performance, to preventing muscle cramping, especially in extreme environments where sweat losses are large, sodium losses are large, that accumulate over multiple hours of competition. Also, what is the risk of including a reasonable amount of sodium in your supplement strategy or your fueling strategy or your hydration strategy? Relatively little, as long as you keep the amounts reasonable and you've tried and practiced the amounts that you're going to use. There's not a lot of risk to doing this. So for an athlete, for example, that's competing in the Western States endurance run, having a knowledge of their sweat sodium concentration, developing a specific plan for that in terms of replacement makes more sense to me in terms of the risk versus reward than an athlete who maybe is training for a marathon in a relatively cool environment where most of their training runs are no more than 2 hours, and they don't have a history of cramping extensively. There's no reason to advocate that the athlete really needs to know precisely what their sweat sodium losses are. So thinking through the context of who that athlete is, what their training is like, and then what their competitions are like, along with whether they seem to be a salty sweater or not, is kind of the puzzle you need to think through in order to decide whether or not sodium testing and precise sodium supplementation is needed for a particular situation.